Yeah, g'day YouTube. Wobbles on a lot here. And I've been thinking about anti-natalism and parenting. Not only from the angle that I've explored many, many times before about the way to be a miserably depressed atheist is to have not enough cuddles in the first 3 years of your life. And that could in fact predispose you to becoming an anti-natalist because your limbic system hardwires back then, and if you've hardwired emotionally as a toddler having a temper tantrum because you didn't get enough attention because your parents were busy doing something else, that's one way of looking at anti-natalism and parenting. The other way of looking at anti-natalism and parenting is what sort of parents are anti-natalists likely to make? Not as silly a question as it sounds, because on the one hand, I've read a comment thread discussion where anti-natalists were babbling about the way they could avoid being lonely in their old age would be to adopt a child. And they assumed that they would automatically be rescuing said child from an environment where it was otherwise going to be beaten or abused or neglected. A harmful environment that wasn't fit to raise a child. And I just thought, God, these sound like the middle-aged women in Australia who, for whatever reason, couldn't produce a child of their own, so they got the child welfare to go and steal the babies away from young single mothers on the supposition that if you were married and you had a house and plenty of money but you couldn't reproduce, therefore you deserved to have the baby more than the young girl who could actually produce a baby. It's like the level of arrogance and elitism among the people who said, look, rather than have these kids living in homes in England because their single parents can't quite cope with them at the moment, we'll tell the kids that they're orphans and we'll put them on a boat and ship them out to Australia, and we'll put them in sort of child labour camps in the West Australian desert. You know, that'll be better for them than going home to their mother, you know, who's doing it tough because there wasn't any widow's pension in England at the time and her husband had been killed in the Second World War style of thing. It's the sort of arrogance of the people who said that, well, you know, manifest destiny, terra nullius, Aborigines are a dying race. Somehow, although very, very few white men were brave enough to marry an Aboriginal woman, and not very many Aboriginal men were ever allowed to marry a white woman. There's a hell of a lot of part Aboriginal children being born all over inland Australia, and some of them were almost white enough that you could think they were an Englishman with a suntan or an English girl with a suntan. They might perhaps be better off if the state just stole them away from their parents and took them and put them in institutions where the girls were taught to be domestic servants until they got sexually abused by their boss, and the boys were put to work riding horses and rounding up cattle and drenching sheep. So the stolen generation, the forgotten generation, the anti-natalists would like to have another stolen, forgotten generation of kids taken away from their parents. And let's face it, the child welfare authorities are on a bit of an upswing at the moment. You know, perhaps 20 years ago, they were going through a bit of a reality-based phase where they understood that a child's biological parents are genetically engineered to be good at raising that kid, in the sense that they contributed 50% of the DNA that formed the plan that built the kid's brain, and the brain's kind of like a computer. So mummy and daddy's software will run better in the kid's hardware than anybody else's software on planet Earth. The tales of separated adopted children reuniting with their parents after decades of misery are legionary. You know, the idea that a stranger can provide better care for a child than the kid's parents, even under adverse conditions like the bombing of London. You know, at the end of the war, the kids who were evacuated to go and live in the loving care of compassionate strangers, they came back to London, and when compared with the children who stayed there to be bombed by the Luftwaffe, the kids who got bombed by the Luftwaffe were taller and heavier and had better academic records, despite the interrupted sleep and irregular meals and night terrors and unfamiliar environments. And they had less disciplinary problems and less interactions with the police and the local courts than the kids who were taken out of the home and raised by strangers. The evidence is fairly overwhelming that unless a particular parent or parents have an impact on the kid that's a lot worse than the German bombing of London during the whole of World War II, then the kid's better off with their parents. You know, like maybe if the parents are as bad as what the Royal Air Force did to Hamburg or Cologne or Dresden, or what the US Army Air Corps did to Tokyo. You know, times where they've gone and cooked 130,000 plus people in one night. You know? The RAF raid on Dresden killed more people in one night in one raid than everything the Luftwaffe did over England for the whole of the Second World War. Yet somehow the Nazis were the barbarians? But anyway, that's how bad your parenting has to be before the kid's better off with somebody else. It's got to be as bad as the RAF's treatment of Dresden. Can't be only as bad as the Blitz of London. So that's one point. I don't think there are too many people who are treating their kid badly enough that they can't be re-educated to at least understand what good parenting is, so they might have a better chance of dealing with the next stressful interlude more constructively than they did the last stressful interlude. You know, just because somebody's beaten their kid for a couple of years because that's how they were raised doesn't mean they're going to continue to beat the kid. And me personally, I was beaten as a kid by parents and school teachers. I thought it was the right thing to do. Talk to the kid, shout at the kid, beat the kid, double the beating if they do the wrong thing. Well, I found the error of my ways. But some people apparently don't stop. I did stop. Had a bit of help stopping. You know, like first I saw I'd put a mark on a child while beating the child, and that was when I decided to stop. Then society noticed I'd put a mark on the child while beating the child, and they decided to stop me after I'd stopped anyway. So I got to plead guilty to making a mark on a child while beating the child. Terribly humiliating, didn't like it at all. And then not a horribly long time after that, I got a little bit more help in curtailing my yell, scream, shout, beat the kid reflex when I crashed my aeroplane and I broke my foot. And at that time, I think the kids in the house would have been about 9 and 7 and 3 and 1.5. I think that's about how old the kids were. The two older boys might have been older, but I know my kids, my biological kids, they were 3 and 1.5 when they watched Daddy go upside down over the fence post into the potato patch. And I came out of that on crutches, and then a crutch and then a walking stick. And I have never been faster on foot since then than the children, any of them, stepchildren or biological children. It wasn't possible to be a screaming, shouting, horrible person because the kids could just walk away. So yeah, I had a lot of help stopping. First I saw I'd done the wrong thing, then society stopped me, then the universe stepped in and made it impossible for me to keep going down that wrong track. But when I was beating kids, I was reverting to the way I was raised when I was that old. You know, give the kid a backhander, smack him for doing the wrong thing, bark at him, keep the kid living in basically a state of fear and anxiety. And it was pretty normal in the 60s. Certainly when my father was a kid it was normal. He was 52 when I was born. So, not really his fault. He did his best. Not really me mum's fault. She did her best, you know. But a lot of people are out there yelling and shouting at their kids, thinking they're doing the right thing, and they wind up in court and they stop. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to take the kids away and put them into foster care or adopt them out just because they're being beaten by their parents. I don't know how successful you can be in preventing a parent from re-offending with sexual assault matters. If they've sexually assaulted the kid, I think probably the offensive parent should be ejected from the household. I don't know. I really don't know what to say about that one. I didn't sexually abuse any of the kids in my care, so I don't see that anybody who sexually abuses children should have a whole lot of unsupervised access to the kids. I think anybody who reckons that children are attractive should be kept away from kids. You know, sexually attractive, sexually active, those sort of adults shouldn't be allowed to have unsupervised access to the kids. But whether that means the kid should be taken away from the other parent too and farmed out, you know, to a well-meaning anti-natalist, no, I don't follow that leap of conclusion. And the other thing is, how is the child welfare authorities going to take the idea of a parent who's become an anti-natalist after they've got kids? You know, you might have a couple of toddlers at foot and you're off at the pub and meet some marvellous stranger who's an anti-natalist evangelist or a throbbing ephalist, weaves a spell of words, pulls you into their thrall and makes an anti-natalist or an ephalist of you. How is that going to affect your relationship to your own children? Having successfully raised a couple of kids who are more or less happy, I mean, they've got their issues because it was a pretty horrible failed marriage and a disputed custody situation too, but my kids are both pretty happy with themselves at the moment, more or less, sort of. At least neither one of them's an anti-natalist. They're both atheists. They're sometimes depressed, not often, but they're not anti-natalists. They reckon life is worth living. I think that's a bit of a victory, to raise a kid who thinks life is worth living. But I couldn't have been optimistic enough to have surrounded them in an atmosphere of happiness when they were toddlers if I thought life was not worth living and that life was bound to be an endless procession of suffering, and that because I'd conceived them, therefore I had doomed them to a miserable life. I just don't see how I could pull that off. Probably I'm projecting to suggest that if it's difficult for me to imagine it, then it's difficult for anybody else to do it. But, you know, I try to empathise, I try to put myself in somebody else's situation and look at it from their view. And, you know, if I believed that life was not worth living, could I convince a kid that life was worth being happy with as they're growing up? Or would I infect them with my whinging and whining and moaning and groaning and grizzling and griping and howling and bitching and complaining and kicking up a fuss and focusing and fixating on any miserable aspect of any situation I could think about? Could I keep that away from a child growing up under my roof? I probably couldn't, you know, like I couldn't keep from explaining to kids how interesting I found aeroplanes. And I taught them to build paper aeroplanes and play with toy aeroplanes, and neither one of them spends much time knowing about aeroplanes, but they both went through a phase where they were into aeroplanes. I remember the first day my newborns looked up at me after the home birth on the lounge room couch, and they locked eyes with me. And they sort of communicated to me that because I was the father that they'd heard my voice before they were born, they expected me to look after them physically and explain their world to them. So I really don't see how an anti-natalist parent could explain life to a child in a way that would not fairly emotionally, psychologically cripple the child with suicidal ideation. You know, what you been doing all day, mummy / daddy? Oh, I've been all day making anti-natalist movies. What's that, mummy, daddy? Oh, we're explaining why life isn't worth living and it's better never to have been, and because you're here you can suffer and therefore life is up to shit, kid. Oh, okay then. I'll just go out and try planking in the 3-lane traffic, will I? It's a difficult thing to get my head around. My intellectual belief based on the evidence that I've reviewed before you, that, you know, parenting's got to be really bad before you take the kid away. Okay, I won't intervene. I'll let the anti-natalists run their experiment of having kids and seeing how much or how little damage they're going to do to their kids, because maybe they can pull it off. Maybe they can raise a happy kid even in an anti-natalist household. But Jesus, I wouldn't like to try it. I really wouldn't. I don't see how it could be done. But the question is, assuming the kids in question are growing up in a failed relationship where there's a legalistic dispute going on between mummy and daddy as to who the kids get to live with, oh, I suppose the anti-natalist would just say, that's it, go away, I don't want to have anything to do with kids because I'm an anti-natalist. But assuming you've got an anti-natalist who's in the emotional tug-of-war where they're bonded to the kid and they want to make sure that they have time with the kid, if they're contesting custody or residence and access and the other parent knows, well, my estranged hates life, have a look at what they say on YouTube, shows that to the child welfare authorities, I could nearly bet all my worldly goods on the theory that the child welfare authorities are going to come down on the side of the idea that the kids are in emotional danger by staying with a parent who is going to fill their ears with anti-natalism. That's just my guess, my bet. So, speaking bravely on an evidence-based position that biological parents are genetically engineered to be best at raising their children, I would say, if you've got kids and an anti-natalist evangelist starts yapping at you, just stick your fingers in your ears and walk away. Especially if you're a depressed atheist and you've got kids and an anti-natalist wants to talk to you, just tell them to, go away, talk to somebody else. Talk to somebody who hasn't got kids. If you've got kids and you're an anti-natalist, I really think you should rethink your position and try and shield your kid from your negative vibe as much as you possibly can. You're probably going to disagree with me, but that's the nature of dispute, discussion, argument, dissent. And because I find myself increasingly being blocked by the anti-natalist echo chamber, the people who want to make movies to convince the rest of the world to pay attention to anti-natalism, but they can't cope with anybody who questions their authority or disputes their points or dissents against any of their positions on the comment thread. I got blocked by another one of them today, which is in fact what has focused my mind onto anti-natalists, and the only way I can get the message across is to make a clip about it. So, yeah, Grey Tycho, wasn't that a clever fucking thing to do, dickwit? You've now got me airing my queries as to whether anti-natalism is child abuse and what the Child Welfare Authority's position on antinatalism and parenting is likely to be. So if somebody's got some answers to those queries, I'd be happy to be told of them. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Life is a good choice. Ciao.